Churchill got up before a map with his pointer, and he kept pointing to Gibraltar, North Africa, the Mediterranean, Sicily, and Italy. Finally, he said, "We should slit the soft belly of the Mediterranean." Well, my friends, I assure you, when I landed at Salerno, I found it was a tough old gut. U.S. Army General Mark Clark. Welcome to the history of the 20th century. Episode 416, The Iron Gut of Europe. When we last talked about Italy, I left off at the end of September 1943 and noted that the Allied force in that country had gotten bogged down by an able German defense led by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. His fellow Field Marshal, Erwin Rommel, had recommended the Wehrmacht abandon the Italian peninsula and draw its defensive line in the northern part of the country. Kesselring thought that would miss an opportunity. The rugged terrain of the peninsula was a defender's dream, and Kesselring believed he could hold off the Allies in southern Italy for a long time. Hitler had to make the call, and at first he was inclined to take the advice of Rommel, who was his favorite commander, until the SS advised him they had reason to believe Rommel was politically unreliable, and so Kesselring got his way. On the Allied side, their troubles in Italy reopened old arguments between British and American leaders. From the get-go, Churchill had favored nibbling at the edges of Axis-occupied Europe, so to speak, a long-standing British strategy for intervening in continental conflicts, while the Americans were gung-ho about taking the Germans head-on with an invasion somewhere in Western Europe, most likely France. The British had to talk the Americans into the invasion of French North Africa. That invasion had proved relatively easy and had paid substantial dividends. It gave the French resistance a shot in the arm, and it helped de Gaulle consolidate his position as its leader, though that last part was unintentional. It also forced Rommel and his panzers out of Africa and gave the Allies useful air and naval bases on the continent's north coast. Then the British pushed for the invasion of Sicily. That had been a tougher sell, but it ended the Axis threat to Allied Mediterranean shipping, and therefore freed up cargo ships that would then be available to supply that coming invasion of Europe the Americans were so keen on. So even they had to admit the results had been worth the effort. And don't forget that invasion also triggered the overthrow of Mussolini. Next, the British pushed for an invasion of the Italian mainland. It seemed like a good idea at the time. The new Italian prime minister had been in secret talks with the Allies about switching sides, but the Italians had wanted Allied boots on the ground in their country to help protect them against the wrath of the Germans. So that seemed worth doing, especially since this was the time when the Germans were contemplating Rommel's plan to withdraw from Italy altogether, and the Allies knew it from their Enigma intercepts. So the British landed forces at various points in southern Italy and met little resistance. Then the Americans landed their Fifth Army at Salerno and expected the same. But the Germans had anticipated the landing, and Kesselring fought them bitterly on the ground, while the Luftwaffe pounded them from the air. American casualties were high, and military commanders contemplated evacuating their forces altogether, until heavy naval fire from British warships broke the German attack and the British Eighth Army reached the Americans' position. The British Eighth Army was commanded by Bernard Montgomery, or Bernard Montgomery if you're British, who had been sharpening his public relations skills ever since El Alamein. By September 1943, he was handing out autographed pictures of himself as if he were Tyrone Power or something. After his army linked up with the American beachhead at Salerno, Montgomery began talking as if he and his Eighth Army had saved the Americans from destruction. This went over not at all well with the commander of the American Fifth Army, U.S. General Mark Clark, who thought Montgomery had taken his good old time advancing to Salerno and resented it. It didn't help that, if anything, Mark Clark was a worse publicity hound than even Montgomery. Clark eventually expanded the Fifth Army's press office to 50 people and lectured photographers on the importance of capturing him in profile. He thought that was his best look. Clark also became obsessed with the thought of leading the force that liberated Rome. The ancient city had experienced any number of famous military commanders marching through its streets in triumph, and Clark was eager to add his name to that list of immortals. A few of his subordinates began referring to the general as Marcus Aurelius Clarkus behind his back. Now that the Allied forces had linked up, what comes next? General Eisenhower had predicted Rome would fall by the end of October, but the campaign sure wasn't shaping up that way. Allied hopes of capturing the entire peninsula in one bold stroke had been dashed, and now there was no plan, apart from a vague idea that the Americans would advance north along the west coast of the peninsula and the British would advance up the east coast. The two armies combined officially made up the Allied 15th Army Group, under the command of British General Harold Alexander, and above him, American General Dwight Eisenhower. But neither of them offered any bright ideas. By this time, the Americans were increasingly turning their attention to Operation Overlord. As far as they were concerned, everything else was subordinate to the coming invasion of France. The Americans scratched Douglas MacArthur's proposed invasion of New Britain for the sake of maximizing the numbers of soldiers, equipment, supplies, and supply ships available for Overlord. I will have more to say about that in a coming episode. There was nothing left over to contribute to beefing up the Italian front either. You have to think that senior American commanders were beginning to regret having landed forces in mainland Italy at all, and wondering if this was another British attempt to divert them from Overlord. The one senior American commander who agreed with the British was General Carl Spaatz, who at this point in our narrative was commander of the U.S. Army Air Force's 12th Air Force based in Tunisia. General Spaatz would be appointed commander of the 15th Air Force based in Italy in November 1943, and overall commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe in January 1944. Spaatz was a key member of that group of Army Air Force officers derogatorily referred to as the Bomber Mafia by their opponents in the military. These were the American Air Force commanders who advanced the view that strategic bombing of Germany alone could win the war, and that Operation Overlord would be neither necessary nor desirable. This is the same view held by the commander of the RAF's Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, or Bomber Harris, as the British press liked to call him. General Spaatz advocated for the U.S. Army to press onward up the Italian peninsula, reasoning that as the Italian front drew closer to Germany, his bomber force would get closer to targets in Germany, and the bombing campaign would become increasingly effective until it forced a German collapse. Who needs Operation Overlord? Here's a fun fact. Carl Spaatz was born in Boyertown, Pennsylvania, which is just a hop, skip, and a jump from where I live. But the most senior official advocating for a Mediterranean strategy was, as always, Winston Churchill. It had been Churchill who talked Roosevelt into invading North Africa, and then Sicily, and then Italy. Churchill's advocacy had certainly spared the Americans what would likely have been a bloody and disastrous failed invasion of France in 1943, if they'd had their way. and he'd been proved right about the value of the invasions of North Africa and Sicily. The Italian campaign, on the other hand, was more of a mixed bag. But Churchill, far from recalibrating his strategic thinking after the Allies got stuck in southern Italy, doubled down on it by advocating for an invasion of the Dodecanese Islands, especially the island of Rhodes. In part, this was because he believed that an Allied demonstration of military superiority, in the form of evicting a German force stationed on Turkey's doorstep, would be enough to persuade Ankara to join the Allied cause. Surely he was also thinking about that invasion of the Balkans he was so keen on, and with Turkish assistance if all went according to plan. The Americans were bemused and frustrated by Churchill, no one more so than Franklin Roosevelt, who had thought they'd thrashed this all out in Quebec in August, and that Churchill had conceded the primacy of overlord. Yet it seemed Churchill was still trying to lead them down the path to that invasion of the Balkans he kept going on about. Even the chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, who was on the same page as Churchill, at least insofar as agreeing on the importance of the Mediterranean front, thought he was pushing too hard. He wrote in his diary, "The Prime Minister has worked himself into a frenzy of excitement about the Rhodes attack, has magnified its importance so he can no longer see anything else, and has set his heart on capturing this one island, even at the expense of endangering his relations with the President and with the Americans, and also the whole future of the Italian campaign. The Americans are already desperately suspicious of him, and this will make matters far worse." George Marshall and the American military wanted nothing to do with an invasion of Rhodes, so the British attempted to do it on their own. In early September, just after the Italian government announced it was switching sides, the British attempted to take control of the Dodecanese in coordination with the Italian army garrisons on the islands. Churchill asked for American assistance in the operation. The Americans declined. The Italians on the islands were for the most part willing to follow their orders from Rome and switch sides, but the Germans had other plans. German forces on the islands, reinforced by German occupation forces transferred from Greece, succeeded in ejecting the British and taking the Italians prisoner. Some 100 Italian officers were executed on the spot for the crime of obeying the orders of the Italian government. Admiral Inigo Campioni, the overall commander of Axis forces in the Dodecanese, and one other Italian admiral stationed in the islands, were taken prisoner and handed over to the government of Mussolini's Italian Social Republic, which tried and executed them for treason. The situation in Italy was scarcely any better. Eisenhower's timeline of taking Rome by October proved a fantasy. The Germans had not withdrawn from Italy as expected. Instead, they'd put up an able defense and were making the Allies pay dearly for every inch of progress. Much of the credit for this has to go to the German commander, Albert Kesselring, a shrewd tactician who proved again and again his ability to organize tough defensive lines, even in difficult circumstances. Kesselring's most valuable ally was Italian geography. The most striking feature of the Italian peninsula, apart from its strong resemblance to a boot, is that it is long and nearly uniform in width. The peninsula measures roughly 1,000 kilometers in length and averages roughly 200 kilometers in width until it splits at the southern end. To put this in American terms, the Italian peninsula is roughly the same length and width as the Florida peninsula. Unlike the Florida peninsula, though, where the average elevation is less than 100 feet, Italy is a rugged country. The spine of the peninsula is comprised of a series of mountain ranges collectively known as the Apennines. Many of its mountaintops are 2,000 meters or more above sea level, that's 6,000 feet in American, and mountains make excellent defensive terrain. Because of these mountains, you won't be surprised to learn, rivers in Italy typically flow from a source in the Apennines, either westward to the Tyrrhenian Sea or eastward to the Adriatic. Now put all this together and imagine yourself as an Allied commander thinking about how to advance your army along the peninsula. Sending your troops up the middle would be out of the question. If the Allies had tried that, they would still be fighting there. The only other option is to advance along the coastal lowlands on either side of the peninsula, or if you happen to have both a British army and an American army at your disposal, send the Americans up the west coast of the peninsula and the British up the east coast, which is what they did. But this geography forces the advancing armies to squeeze into relatively narrow passages on either side of the mountains and cross a series of rivers that flow perpendicularly to their line of advance, which greatly simplifies Kesselring's job. Oh, and one more thing. The last 3 months of the year are the rainy season in Italy, and given the geography I just described, rain in the mountains makes those rivers prone to flooding, often quickly and unexpectedly, as Bernard Montgomery and Mark Clark soon discovered. To sum up the situation from the Allied point of view, and using the standard military terminology of the British Army, I believe this would technically qualify as a right old mess. The Americans originally landed at Salerno because it was as far north along the Italian coast as they could get and still enjoy air cover from Allied air units based in Sicily. It was also as close as they could get to the Italian port city of Naples and still enjoy air cover from Allied units based in Sicily. Naples is the third largest city in Italy, after Rome and Milan. At this time, its population was just shy of 1 million. The city has stood since ancient times and has traditionally been a center of culture and scholarship. During the Baroque era, it was the largest city in the Mediterranean region. It had once been the capital of the Kingdom of Naples, and from 1815 to 1861, capital of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Naples was the American landing force's first objective. Kesselring's counterattack postponed any plan to advance northward until September 19th, after the British Eighth Army linked up with them, and Allied air and naval bombardments forced the Germans to withdraw. The Allies began the advance on Naples along the west coast of Italy. They had to split their forces in two to get around Mount Vesuvius, which, as I'm sure you already know, meant marching past the ruins of the ancient and ill-fated towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Meanwhile, in Naples, the city was on the brink. After the armistice with the Allies was announced, some 5,000 Italian soldiers in the region left their units and wandered into Naples, where the German army had stationed some 20,000 soldiers to garrison the city. Neapolitans resented the German presence, which they correctly perceived as an enemy occupation force. Tensions were high, and they grew higher after the Americans made their surprise amphibious landing at Salerno, just 50 kilometers to the south. Violent clashes broke out between Neapolitan civilians and German military personnel. Some of this violence was a spontaneous public reaction to the German occupation and the news that the Americans were approaching. Some of it was encouraged by Italian resistance groups. The unrest in Naples grew as the Germans began capturing and deporting those Italian soldiers to do forced labor in Germany. The German military commander in Naples declared martial law, imposed a curfew, and threatened summary execution for any act of violence against German soldiers. The Germans then began staging public executions of Italian soldiers and Italian police who had offered resistance to the German occupation. These executions were held in front of audiences of hundreds of Italian civilians whom the Germans rounded up and forced to watch. On September 23rd, the Germans ordered all Italian men between 18 and 30 to report for deportation to Germany for forced labor. Only a handful of Neapolitans voluntarily complied. German soldiers began scouring the city for the men who had disobeyed the order. On the 26th, riots broke out in the streets as citizens began freeing those who had been captured. The next 4 days, September 27th to 30th, are known to the Italians as Le Quattro Giornate di Napoli, that is, the 4 days of Naples. Rioters clashed repeatedly with German soldiers who responded by firing into crowds of civilians. The rioters captured and distributed stockpiles of German arms and fought back against German efforts to destroy buildings in Naples to deny them to the Allies. On the 29th, a 23-year-old woman named Maddalena Cereswolo led a band of resistance fighters to defend the Ponte della Sanità, a key bridge on the route north from Naples built in 1809, which German engineers were attempting to blow up. The Ponte della Sanità is today known as the Ponte Maddalena Cereswolo. Outside the city, a unit of approaching British soldiers encountered a group of Italian villagers in a cemetery. They were laying to rest the remains of 10 young men who had been killed by the Germans. Shortly after the British left, a squad of German soldiers appeared and fired on the mourners. The Germans withdrew from Naples on the 30th, as British and American army units closed in on the city. Before leaving, they set fire to the National Library, the Library of the University of Naples, and the State Archives, destroying irreplaceable historical documents. An estimated 155 Italians were killed in the uprising. The Allies entered on October 1st and discovered a looted city. The Germans had destroyed the port facilities, the railroad tracks, gas, sewer, and water lines, and most of the city's bridges. The 4 days of Naples were costly to the Italians, but on the other side of the ledger, Italian resistance saved tens of thousands of young men from a deportation to Germany, from which many would never have returned. And the uprising forced the Germans to evacuate the city rather than use it as a defensive position against the Allies. We can only guess how many lives, how many buildings, and how many Italian cultural treasures were thereby spared. The Germans fell back to a new defensive line along the river Volturno, about 30 kilometers north of Naples. The Allies reached the river on October 6th. It took a week for them to put together a mass artillery barrage sufficient to break up the German defense and allow a crossing. Rainy weather and muddy roads slowed the Allied advance. Allied soldiers suffered cases of trench foot, which is what happens to soldiers whose feet suffer prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. The Germans put up stiff resistance, including laying mines and hiding anti-tank guns to ambush Allied units. They blew up every bridge along the way. In 1940, an English engineer named Donald Bailey offered a design for a new type of bridge that soon became known as the Bailey Bridge. Bailey bridges are made from a relatively small number of uniform prefabricated steel components, small enough and light enough that they can be carried around in trucks, lifted by teams of soldiers, and quickly assembled in the field to build a replacement bridge. Soldiers can put together a Bailey bridge and push it over the gap they want to cross, no heavy equipment required. The soldiers don't even need access to the other side of the gap, and the finished bridge is strong enough to allow tanks to cross. Bailey bridges were first used in combat conditions in North Africa by British, Canadian, and American units, but the Bailey Bridge really proved itself in Italy, where Allied soldiers assembled 3,000 of them. Only in Italy there were so many rivers and so much rugged terrain that Allied units soon ran out of the parts they needed to build these bridges. Getting more parts and transporting them up the muddy Italian roads to the front line proved a major logistical challenge. The Germans' dogged delaying tactics were only part of Kesselring's plan. He identified a line across the Italian peninsula that would make a nearly ideal defensive position for his forces, the Gustav Line. This line ran 160 kilometers across the peninsula at its narrowest point, making use of the river Sangro on the Adriatic side of the mountains and the river Garigliano on the Tyrrhenian side, and anchored in between by the rugged mountains around the Italian town of Cassino. The Allies knew from Enigma intercepts that Kesselring had chosen this challenging terrain as the place where he and his army would make their stand. Complicating the situation, and to the dismay of the British, the Americans insisted they honor their prior agreement to withdraw 7 divisions from the Mediterranean and redeploy them for Operation Overlord, now just 6 months away. The loss of these 7 divisions would concede to the Germans numerical superiority in Italy, at least for a while. I won't trouble you with the names of the subsidiary German defensive lines south of the Gustav Line. Suffice it to say that the Germans mounted an expert defense. That defense, plus the cold, wet weather, plus supply problems due in part to Allied inexperience with rugged terrain, meant a slow advance, with Allied troops forced into tough battles every step of the way. This slow and costly slog up the Italian peninsula couldn't have been more different from what these soldiers got used to in North Africa, with its broad, flat terrain and dry weather, which made possible sweeping advances by armor and motorized units. Here, the terrain negated the Allied advantage in numbers of tanks and vehicles, rendering them all but useless. The terrain along the approaches to Rome would force any Allied advance into one of 3 possible routes. There were Italian state routes 6 and 7, which approached Italy from the south. The Italian state route 7 follows the course of the ancient Roman Appian Way. Clark and his Fifth Army would have to use one or both of these routes, but the trouble with either of them is that they both run between mountains that would make excellent positions from which the Germans could rain artillery fire on advancing Allied troops. The third option was Route 5, which approaches Rome from the east, along a route beginning on the Adriatic coast and crossing the width of the peninsula. Montgomery's Eighth Army, on that coast, conceivably could fight their way across and help flank the German defenses south of Rome, but this route would take them through the full width of the mountains. With the mud and snow they were facing, this option wasn't exactly attractive. Route 7, which runs closer to the coast than Route 6, would also force advancing soldiers through the Pontine Marshes, which are saltwater marshes that line the coast for about 45 kilometers south and east of Rome. Here, the Roman Appian Way runs along the inland edge of the marshes. These marshes were home to a species of mosquito that adapted to salt water and was also a carrier of malaria, which plagued the region since ancient times. Roman soldiers marching south along the Appian Way made it a point to hurry and get past the marshes as quickly as possible. Over the centuries, there were various efforts to drain the marshes. In 1929, the fascist government of Italy began an ambitious 10-year project of dikes, pumps, and canals that drained the swamps, cleared out the mosquitoes, and made the land available to settlers, mostly veterans of the last war, who were given a house and land and agricultural equipment with which to start a family farm. The program was a success and a propaganda boon for Mussolini and fascism. But now, if Allied forces approached Rome, the Germans could, and ultimately did, destroy the pumps, demolish the tidal gates, and deliberately reflood the region to turn it back into salt marshes, which meant the Allies would have to fight their way through a mosquito-infested swamp. The Germans were blowing up everything else across Italy as they retreated. They also seized stocks of food, creating a famine. By now, the Germans were treating Italy as harshly as any of the other European countries they occupied. Even Benito Mussolini and his cabinet ministers, the puppet government of the Italian Social Republic, were pressing the Germans to ease up on the looting and destruction. Their pleas went unanswered. It took until November for the Allies to reach the Gustav Line. On the Adriatic coast, where the terrain was a little easier and the German defenders fewer, Montgomery had ambitions of breaking through the Gustav Line and taking advantage of Route 5 to march his army westward across the enemy rear, which would force a withdrawal and free up Clark's army to continue their advance. But easier said than done. The Eighth Army was short on supplies. Allied supply ships were arriving regularly at the port of Bari on the Adriatic coast, but Allied command was giving first priority to building up the 15th Air Force, which is now under the command of General James Doolittle, he of the Doolittle Raid. This force, based in southern Italy, was thought crucial to stepping up the pressure on German industry. They could reach targets in southern Germany, Austria, and the Balkans that were unreachable from England. Here on the east coast, the German defenders took advantage of the river Sangro, assisted by heavy rains that caused the river to flood and kept Allied warplanes out of the sky. Pontoon bridges built across the river were swept away in the floods. Beyond the Sangro was another river, the Moro, and then the town of Ortona, and beyond that, the eastern end of Route 5, the potential path to crossing the peninsula and breaking the Gustav Line. On November 27th, the New Zealand 2nd Division, which was still commanded by Bernard Freyberg, whom we've encountered a couple of times now, crossed the Sangro and began a fierce battle to secure a beachhead on the far side. On December 6th, the Canadian 1st Division began an attack intended to cross the Moro and take Ortona. 9 days of ferocious combat followed as the Canadians went up against a German paratrooper division and a Panzer Grenadier division, some of the best soldiers in the German army. On December 21st, as the bloodied Canadians approached Ortona, German engineers blew up the town. The German paratroopers continued to oppose the Canadians from the ruins of the city, as a brutal battle was fought through the rubble for another week before Ortona was secure. The Canadians called it Little Stalingrad. They lost 500 killed, 2,000 with physical injuries, and many more afflicted with battle fatigue. The year 1944 dawned, with German defenders holding fast. Mark Clark's dream of liberating Rome was nowhere near reality. Eisenhower and Montgomery had both left the Mediterranean to take up their commands for Operation Overlord. And south of Italy, in Tunis, was Winston Churchill. His return to London from the Tehran conference had been delayed by heart trouble. He was in Tunis to convalesce. And from there, he proposed a plan to break the stalemate in Italy. But that is a story for another episode. we'll have to stop here for today. I thank you for listening, and I'd like to thank Phil and Mike for their kind donations, and thank you to Andrew for becoming a patron of the podcast. Donors and patrons like Phil and Mike and Andrew help cover the costs of making this show, which in turn keeps the podcast available free for everyone always. So my thanks to them and to all of you who have pitched in and helped out. If you'd like to become a patron or make a donation, you are very welcome. Just visit the website historyofthe20thcentury.com and click on the PayPal or Patreon buttons. As always, the podcast website also contains notes about the music used on the podcast. So if you hear a piece of music and you'd like to know more about it, including the composer, the performers, and a link to where you could download it, that would be the place to go. And while you're there, you can always leave a comment and let me know what you thought about today's show. I've been thinking about doing a question and answer episode in which I would answer questions from you, my listeners. This depends on whether I have enough listeners who have enough questions to fill up an episode, so let's find out. If you have a question for me that you'd like to hear me answer on the podcast, send it to the email address historyofthe20thcentury@gmail.com. And please let me know if and how you'd like to be named if I use your question. And let's see what happens. And I hope you'll join me next week here on the History of the 20th Century. It's time to take a break from the war, so we're going to look at some important women singers of the time. We're also going to talk about that movie, the one I haven't talked about yet, Over the Rainbow, next week, here on the History of the 20th Century. Oh, and one more thing. I mentioned that the British Eighth Army was getting its supplies through the port of Bari on the Adriatic coast of Italy. The British captured Bari shortly after they first landed in Italy, and they had been using the port ever since. On December 2nd, 1943, British Air Marshal Sir Arthur Cunningham, who was in command of Allied tactical air forces in the Mediterranean, held a press conference in Bari in which he assured the assembled journalists that the Germans had lost the air war over Italy. He emphasized the point by saying, "I would consider it a personal insult if the enemy should send so much as one plane over the city." That very night, some 30 Allied cargo ships were docked in Bari, a city of about 250,000 people. The port facilities were fully lit because the port was unloading cargo round the clock due to the Allied supply shortages in Italy. At 7:30 that evening, over 100 Luftwaffe Junkers 88 bombers appeared over Bari. The port had no anti-aircraft guns. Allied fighter aircraft in southern Italy were all engaged on other missions. The German bombing attack was devastating. 28 Allied merchant ships were destroyed, 15 others were damaged. 2 ships carrying loads of ammunition exploded with such force they shattered windows across the city. 1 bomb cut a fuel pipeline, and burning gasoline poured into the harbor. The raid shut down the port for 3 months, further complicating the Allied supply situation in Italy. One of the 28 ships destroyed was an American Liberty ship named the John Harvey. This ship was carrying a highly classified cargo, a load of mustard gas bombs. You may have noticed that while both sides used chemical weapons during the last war, this time around we haven't seen any of that. Both sides in the European theater had chemical weapons, but they were both holding them in reserve to be used only in retaliation after the other side used them first. Neither side ever did use them. After the war, Hermann Göring said that among the reasons Germany had for not using these weapons was their heavy dependence on horses for transport. The Germans had been unable to develop a practical gas mask for a horse, and feared that no matter what good a gas attack might do for the Wehrmacht, it would be negated by the loss of large numbers of horses and the subsequent hindering of the flow of supplies. As for the raid on Bari, the John Harvey was bringing in mustard gas bombs just in case the Germans used chemical weapons in Italy. When the ship was destroyed, it released the gas across the harbor and the city. Over 600 military personnel at the port were injured. Allied leaders kept the presence of the gas secret even after the bombing raid, out of a fear that if the Germans learned of the presence of gas bombs in Italy, it might provoke them to use chemical weapons. 83 of the military victims died, in many cases due to mustard gas poisoning that went untreated because the doctors and medics were unaware of their exposure. 3 months later, the U.S. military publicly admitted to the release of mustard gas during the raid. No record exists of casualties among Italian civilians who were in Bari that night, and no one knows how many of them were killed or injured by the mustard gas.